Without a doubt, we live in the age of the influencer. Anyone can become a celebrity overnight. Personalities and celebrities are no longer constrained to your typical television programming hours and to a television set. They are carried around with us on our phones. And in a world where millions of people are vying for your attention and selling you products that adhere to certain conceptions of the good life, the average person becomes a sailboat tossed at the mercy of shifting winds and waves. The story of the week prompted me to write this reflection. A particular health and lifestyle influencer, whose name I will not be mentioning, was recently arrested after making death threats to another celebrity. He had previously lost his credibility after it was discovered that he was maintaining his physique using steroids rather than the supplements he'd advertised. He had earned a pretty penny at some point, but it seems after much drug use and excessive and outlandish lifestyle, he simply lost his mind. There are a lot of scammers, con artists, and fake personalities out there. Those who would seek to use and abuse their newly granted positions of power and authority. Some listeners, who are perhaps more conspiratorially minded, might suggest that there are nefarious individuals in hidden positions of power who wield some occult influence over the masses, through their promotion of these harmful influencers in order to subjugate or keep the masses distracted and passive. Perhaps there is an element of truth in this. But I also believe that to lay the blame entirely on society and those who manipulate its form and trajectory using money and influence is only half the problem. Responsibility must also lie with the individual. One who is not developed in virtue and does not know how to exercise it will be condemned to locating the good life in the world of appearances and the world of seeming, obsessed with status and the world's superficialities. I admit that I find most online influencers abhorrent and ugly, not so much in their outward appearance, but in the lack of honor, authenticity, and nobility of spirit that their lifestyle exhibits. I am forever disappointed by the false idols that people set up for themselves. To even think that millions of people around the world could be taken in by such a buffoonish character and sought to emulate his lifestyle always struck me more as a condemnation of the tastes of the masses rather than those of the particular celebrity in question. This issue is also one of scale, since there is a dissolving effect associated with the masses. I believe it was Carl Jung who once said that the dangers of the masses is that, alchemically speaking, they dissolve the individual and free him or her from any moral constraints, as if they become simply a part of a larger organism and take on its destructive and unthinking psyche. Whenever I feel particularly annoyed about where the masses place their energies and trust, I am reminded of one of the acousmata of Pythagoras, who said, "Do not walk on public roads." It is to this advice we must heed. We must also remember that in Book 10 of the Odyssey, Circe the sorceress was able to use her pharmaca to transform all of Odysseus' men into swine, except of course for Odysseus himself. For it is the true individual, the one who is more individuated, who can see through the tricks and resist such charms that affect all the others. For the truth is that we have the capacity to turn away from malignant influence and to discover better models to imitate. For this reason, I do not mean to be too severe on the influencers, for we all need role models to imitate and to show us the right path forward. Olympiodorus, the 6th century AD Alexandrian Neoplatonist, wrote a commentary on the Platonic dialogue of the Alcibiades. Like Proclus before him, Olympiodorus believes the First Alcibiades should be read by those who are just beginning their Platonic studies. We don't have time right now to discuss the Neoplatonic understanding of a dialogue. This would take us too far afield. But I do intend to make a brief video that would situate these philosophical discussions in the appropriate frame. Before he begins his commentary, Olympiodorus says, quote, "But in beginning Plato's philosophy, I would go a step further and say that all human beings reach out for Plato's philosophy because all people wish to draw benefit from it. They are eager to be enchanted by its fountain and to quench their thirst with Plato's inspirations." He then begins to narrate the life of Plato. The purpose of this narrative is to demonstrate to the student the different grades of virtue and excellence that Plato undergoes and can thereby be used as a model for imitation. This idea of mimesis can cloud our understanding a bit here, so let me make it clear that mimesis does not necessarily mean blind and unthinking copying of someone or something, as if what we are being asked to do is merely relive Plato's own life. Firstly, that would be impossible, and secondly, since our constitution is different, since we are indeed uniquely different individuals, we're being asked instead to adopt certain spiritual exercises that would allow us to emulate the patterns of behavior embodied by Plato. For Plato is not merely a man, as Olympiodorus says at the beginning. Quote, "But come, let us also describe the parentage and life of the philosopher, not for the sake of, quote, much learning, but rather to help and prepare those who approach him. For this is no nobody, but rather the one who averts human beings." We are seeing Plato presented as a marvel or a thauma, and this beginning of philosophy where Plato and by association Socrates sit is a confrontation with a revelation, which can be summed up by the famous Delphic injunction to, quote, "know thyself." As we will discover in the Alcibiades, the work concludes that the human being is the soul, and Proclus interprets the self as the soul, while the self itself, the auto to auto, is the rational aspect of the soul. Plato, as the one who, quote, reverts human beings, indicates that we are not speaking of a mere mortal, but of the Apollonian Plato, the one who also makes whole or heals the soul's division. Olympiodorus says that Plato is like the divine physician Asclepius. Quote, "Two did Apollo bring forth, Asclepius and Plato, the one to keep our soul healthy, the other our body." The purpose of philosophy is to first aid us in discovering our true selves. This is why the First Alcibiades is recommended as the preliminary reading of the Platonic corpus. Once we come to know ourselves, we can then ascend the ladder of virtues as we slowly assimilate to the God that is the leader of our series. It is this union or henosis, or identification with the gods as divine individuals, that we come to realize is our most authentic self. This is of course not saying that we become gods in some megalomaniacal hubris or ego inflation, but rather that we are led to a, quote, likeness to God, the homoiosis toi theoi, to the best of our capacities and capabilities. For each person, the degree of attainment of this goal will vary. In an article by Griffin entitled Olympiodorus on the Scale of Virtues, the author says, quote, "As Proclus puts it, we should strive to identify our being in order to understand what is good for us, as Olympiodorus suggests here and elsewhere. The recipe for identifying what is good for us is unique to each individual and grounded in their relationship with their God, oikeos theos." Butler clarifies what is implied in this relationship of henosis. It is not an annihilation of the individual person into God, for example in the Sufi conception of fana, but an apprehension of unity by the God. This unity being not only our intellectual content, but primarily our individuality, which is expressed through our intellect. Since each God is good existentially, and we always aim to approximate our God, we can never fully become identical with the God themselves. And this is great because this prevents a certain level of fanaticism taking hold of the worshipper, whereby that person can state categorically that they alone have the strict definition of the goodness of something purely from their own knowledge of it. This would ultimately make the human the measure of all things, as opposed to the God or the divine being, which is the measure of all things. The God's goodness is beyond intellect and is approached by the unique individual with their particular God in a polytheistic cosmos. Contrary to this discovery of the true self and its correlate of approaching the deity is what Socrates termed the diple amatheia, or double ignorance. Double ignorance is the state not only of influencers, but those majority of human beings who lead, quote, an unexamined life. It is characterized by a dangerous level of overconfidence that one indeed knows what they do not. When celebrities and influencers are placed in such a position, endowed with such trust, such that they can persuade millions of people in so short a time, they risk ethically endangering countless lives. Since, quote, great natures cause great harm when they go without cultivation, just as when they happen to be cultivated, they are the causes of great goods. Simple ignorance, on the other hand, is the state of knowing that one does not know. It contains within it the ability to recognize ignorance. When in dialogue with Alcibiades, Socrates refers to simple ignorance as, quote, most shameful, and double ignorance as, quote, the most shameful thing of all, and the most deserving of reproach. Alcibiades can be described as an aristocrat. He was born into a wealthy and influential Athenian family. I feel uncomfortable completely equating him with the modern influencer, because in my estimation, there's a certain elevated and courageous nature to his character that comes through, perhaps through his natural gifts. However, he is incredibly vain, since he imagines that real beauty lies in physical beauty, and his obsession with his family lineage suggests to us that he has mistaken the outward trappings or appearances of prestige with true nobility. In short, he is an ambitious man who is deeply attached to his reputation and self-image. Rather than dismissing Alcibiades outright, we can learn to be a bit more sympathetic to his erring nature, along with those other influencers. For we can develop a level of sensitivity and sympathy to realize that even those who pursue false images of the good are actually expressing the deep-seated yearning for those things like intelligible beauty that the soul is vainly striving for. Quote, but since every false belief takes its start from a true one, for the false, as a falling away from the true, draws substance from it and depends upon it, lacking the power to exist in its own right. For the true, through its abundance of power, influences even its contrary, the false, and there is no such thing as a total darkening of the common concepts. For all these reasons, we need to articulate Alcibiades' grounds for thinking that what appeared to be good was in fact the greatest good, and then becoming proud about it. Looked at this way, Olympiodorus offers an interesting picture. Quote, we say then that when he was boasting about beauty, he had intelligible beauty in his mind, and he held onto an image, phantasia, of it. But since he lacked the power to obtain it truly, he started, quote, fighting over shadows, over the perceived and apparent. I see something rather pitiful in this fighting over shadows. In a sense, because Alcibiades lacks the power of self-movement or reversion toward true reality, he is inhabiting the world of his imagination in order to satisfy his soul's needs, albeit in a deficient and unsatisfying way. These shadows, just like those that we find projected onto the wall in Plato's cave allegory, also emerge through the constructions and fabrications of appearance. Just like our influencers, their power lies not only in their physical beauty and charm, but in their ability to persuade others. Alcibiades, for instance, takes much pride in his skills of oratory. Both influencers and Alcibiades are able to construct appearances based on sophistical language and seductive appearances. Lane argues that, quote, they are ones who can naturally craft appearances, and most particularly the appearance of being a self, of living the life well lived. Lane also says that, quote, Alcibiades' thoughtless inability to know himself, to be self-moved rather than other-moved, prevent him from authentic self-care. Lest we think that the pursuit and overwhelming preoccupation with appearances, reputation, and status are simply the hallmarks of these ignoble individuals in our society and nothing to do with us, Olympiodorus makes a rather provocative move that implicates all of us on a metaphysical level. Quote, we should investigate why the affection of caring for reputation is most difficult of all to wipe out. Consider, it is so difficult that even those who decide not to care for their reputation do that out of care for their reputation. That is, in order not to appear to care about reputation. We assert, then, that the affection of caring for reputation is difficult to wipe out for the following reason. It is closer to reason than other affections are, and is sibling to it, and reason is not something we can cast aside. Therefore, what is close to reason is difficult to cast aside. Olympiodorus identifies the unavoidable concern for reputation with our soul's reason. Lane describes the situation perfectly. Ultimately, Olympiodorus believes that persons like Alcibiades will not stop caring about their reputation, but will want ever more, because it is not the case that all human beings long for just the same affections, for these are unlimited, but they long for more because they possess a concept of certain other things that they are unable to secure. In other words, the love of reputation is never sated, but due to the veracity and the perfection of the concept of reality and knowledge residing in our souls, we are ever goaded into needing more and better promises of our worth, thus explaining Alcibiades' inability to cast off the admiration of the masses as they continuously feed his need for absolute value. This ceaseless need for absolute value that must be fed to influencers by the masses is reminiscent of the tearing apart of Dionysus by the appetites of the Titans. We are all born with natural virtues, just as a fox's natural virtue is cunning and the lion's natural virtue is courage. These natural virtues arise from our personal temperaments and are in a sense incidental. But when all we do is rely on our natural virtues, which are sensory elements that are merely a product of our souls, we encounter a certain one-sidedness. These one-sided natural virtues are the titanic aspects of our souls, concerned with our body or our possessions. But what is being asked of us by the Neoplatonists is to move from purely natural virtue to a more philosophical virtue in that self-ward turning motion, which involves the exercising of ethical or habitual virtues that allow us to move towards the highest aspect of our souls, to care for the divine within us. These latter virtues are represented by Dionysus and involve, quote, knowledge of laws and rules. When only the natural virtues are expressed at the expense of ethical or habitual virtues, the latter, like Dionysus, are torn apart. Such is the state of the person who lives in double ignorance. The difficulty that we have presented, which is of such titanic proportions, is not merely the concern of the influential few, but pertains to each and every one of us as we proceed through life. The difficulty of this enterprise is apparent by the fact that at the end of the dialogue between Alcibiades and Socrates, he has still not attained the highest degree of virtue and knowledge necessary, for his knowledge remains still at the level of natural virtues. But for a brief moment, Alcibiades gets intimations of his true self, rather than simply vain images. Olympiodorus suggests that at the end of the dialogue, Alcibiades has broken free from his double ignorance, but has not yet attained simple ignorance, and is currently in the transitionary state between the two, a borderland state, mythorios. Quote, and this state lies between simple ignorance, namely knowing that one does not know, and double ignorance, namely firmly supposing that one knows. That is, supposing at one moment that one knows and another not holding that supposition, just as opinion is a mean between double ignorance and knowledge. For a person holding an opinion who knows that it is so, but remains ignorant of why it is so to speak, in the borderlands between those cases. In Olympiodorus' opinion, this is a pivotal moment in the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades, in that he has ascended one more step up that ladder. This is a difficult journey. Let us all be patient with one another and recognize that this is no easy task. And to truly approach the deity is a life's work that requires ceaseless self-inquiry and purification. So know thyself, friends. Gnothi seto. Take care.